everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Of course, the second I press record, every dog in the neighborhood decides to start barking. So, sorry about that. I don't know if the camera microphone will have picked that up or not, but dog barking is happening. That is life in the city. Well, today what I want to discuss is something that came up in a video I did a few weeks ago. I did sort of an Anthony Fantano Let's Argue style video where I responded to your hot takes and opinions about BDSM. And there was one hot take in particular that people seemed to kind of get stuck on. So someone brought up that they thought BDSM was dangerous. And in that video, I essentially said that BDSM is dangerous, and I gave some examples of why, and people responded in the comments with things along the line of, well, you know, BDSM is dangerous, but life is dangerous too. You know, you could accidentally trip on a knife in your kitchen, or you could walk outside your house and get stung by a bee and have a fatal allergic reaction. Or you could drive your car and get into a car accident, and life is just full of danger, so we shouldn't really worry about it because BDSM is dangerous, life is dangerous. Why get bogged down in worrying about that kind of thing? And I think I can understand that sentiment, but because this was an on-the-fly, hot takes type of video, I don't think I really expressed my opinion that well, so I just wanted to dive into that question a little bit deeper since I have the time to do so in a standalone video and talk about, is BDSM really dangerous and should it be something that we are concerned with? Now, in the video, most of the examples I gave were like natural disasters. Things like, you know, if you are chained to a bed overnight and you live in an earthquake-prone area, your risk of dying or being injured in that earthquake is elevated by the fact you are choosing to spend every night locked or chained to a bed. And I would still agree with that. I do think that is something worth considering when it comes to lifestyle BDSM choices that we make. But that is one very, very narrow kind of risk. And I would say that those sorts of choices we make are like subconscious risk evaluations. Like, I don't know if there's really a term for it, but because of the fact that in order for that risk to sort of play out, the thing that precipitates it is so rare as to like barely ever happen or would be considered a catastrophic event all on its own that like adding in the BDSM to it is like a 2%, a 5% like elevated risk chance. I don't really know. So maybe that's not the best thing to go off of. So why don't we look at some of the examples that people gave in their replies? The most common one I saw was driving cars. You know, driving cars is dangerous, but people still choose to drive cars every day. BDSM can be an everyday activity, so why should we worry about it more than we worry about driving our cars? And what I would say to this is we have spent a lot of time collectively as humans studying cars and car safety, like decades and decades of research into what causes car crashes, safety improvements, how different choices affect the risks that are associated with driving a car, like wearing a seatbelt or not, or drinking and driving, or having stoplights, or four-way intersections, or the angle of a curve of a road. Those are things that people have spent a lot of time very deeply studying, and not only just the driving aspect of it, but also the cars themselves with safety tests after safety tests and crash test ratings that you can look at before you even decide to buy a car or not. There's a lot that goes into our risk evaluation with cars. And what I think is important to note here is not only are we very aware of the safety parameters around driving vehicles, and also we wouldn't go up to a new driver and say, cars aren't that dangerous. You don't really need to worry about it that much. Like if somebody's panicking and freaking out about even getting in a car, okay, talk them down a little bit, you know, sort of allow them to get more comfortable with the idea of being in a car. But we don't say driving a car isn't dangerous at all. And so when I am talking about BDSM being dangerous, I'm talking about it in the same way as driving a car is dangerous, because it would be inappropriate to say that driving has no risks or driving never causes anybody to die, because it is one of the leading causes of fatalities. And I think it's something that we can kind of forget about when we have a daily commute or we go on trips, but it is still there. And if BDSM is part of your everyday life, then maybe it kind of takes a similar place in your mind where you're not actively thinking about those risks as much anymore. And I think another analogy we can make here is to birth control, right? You know, it says on the label 99.99% effective, right? There's like a 0.001% chance a year that somebody using this would become pregnant, right? But that's with perfect use. If you go to, say, the Planned Parenthood website and you look at the effectiveness in practice, those percentages are more like 73%, 85%, 90%. And I sort of think about telling somebody that BDSM isn't dangerous as the same as saying just the perfect use risk of somebody getting pregnant using birth control, right? Okay, if you do actually use this perfectly, this is 99% effective. But in reality, when life happens, the actual effectiveness is more like 85%, 90%, what have you. And I think that's important for evaluating your risk and making certain decisions in what you choose to engage in. And so when I'm talking about BDSM being dangerous or not, it's not that it's like the most dangerous thing you could ever do in your whole life, but I want people to assess their risk accurately. Depending on what sorts of areas of BDSM are intriguing to you, there are lots of things that are potentially risky about that particular type of play. And just saying, oh, BDSM isn't really that dangerous is, I think, a little too dismissive for being able to give people that information they need. And when it comes to stories about, say, impact play, right, there's not really a lot of stories about people getting like horrific lifelong injuries from like a flogging or from a caning. But unlike things like driving or birth control, we don't have decades of scientifically backed studies to conclusively say how risky something really is. We don't know what happens to your body when you do an intense flogging, you know, every 2 days, every 3 days, for decades and decades on end. We don't really know what the risks are of flogging somebody on the kidneys or on the stomach, right? Depending on how you approach that and what you sort of intuitively think is risky or not, you might think, oh wow, that's like super dangerous, you should never ever do that. Or you might think, it can't really be that big of a deal, right? But no matter which thing you lean towards, there's not really any data or science you can point to help steer you in a correct direction no matter what your intuition says. And I mean, it's not like we all go around with like car crash statistics in our head or knowing right off the top of our heads what the effectiveness of different birth control is in actual use, but that knowledge is available if you do want to do that research, so you can compare one car to another on their crash test ratings, or compare one birth control to another on how effective they are for average use. And besides just sort of impact play and sensory deprivation and sensation play, there are a lot of forms of BDSM that have inherent risks associated with them that cannot be mitigated away no matter how well you do them. A really great example of this is rope bondage, right? You might be super aware of your nerve locations, you might be really communicative with your partner, you might practice a lot with making sure you're doing everything exactly perfectly for your body and making sure you and your partner are modifying things as needed during the scene. And you might still have something happen where maybe your pinky finger starts to go numb during a scene and starts to get tingly, and you don't recognize it right away, and suddenly you have wrist drop, right? Nerve damage is a feature of doing rope bondage. It is a risk that you take every single time you do rope bondage. Now, depending on where the rope is located and how long you're in the rope and a bunch of other factors, you might be able to make that risk smaller, but the risk is pretty much always there unless you are doing like a single column ankle tie on one ankle with no pressure on it. And so things like rope bondage or blood play or breath play, where those risks cannot be fully mitigated away, those generally get classified under the larger umbrella of like risk-aware consensual kinks, right? Because you cannot get rid of those risks. Those dangers are still present no matter if you follow best practices or not. Those risks can be like 1% or 5% or 10%, and you can move it from 10% to 1% depending on how you practice it, but the risk is always there to some degree. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that yes, some BDSM is just dangerous on the face of it. And if we try to tell people that BDSM really isn't that dangerous and you don't really have to worry about it without any sort of caveat, I think that is misleading people and potentially putting people in harm's way, because the whole idea behind risk-aware consensual kinks is to be risk-aware. And saying BDSM isn't dangerous, to me in my mind, is like saying don't worry about being risk-aware because it's not really something you have to worry about. And even with play that would maybe fall under more of the umbrella of like safe, sane, and consensual, or generally like easier types of play, there's a lot of risks associated with those as well, right? You could get a rotator cuff injury because you do a lot of flogging one weekend and don't stretch appropriately, or, just happen to get injured for some reason. You could be a really heavy pain bottom and do a lot of really heavy play on your back and end up with a bruised rib. You might end up with an infection from accidentally drawing blood during a knife play scene and the knife wasn't appropriately cleaned beforehand. This is not even getting into the emotional and mental risks associated with BDSM, which for me I think is the biggest reason why I say BDSM can be dangerous. Because, doing a little bit of like a light tickling scene or wearing a blindfold or things like that, like they're not really that physically dangerous, but mentally and emotionally, oh boy. Now, if you're somebody who thinks that like mental and emotional risks shouldn't be part of like, is BDSM dangerous or not, we're just gonna have to agree to disagree, because in the years I've done BDSM, in the stories I hear from people, in the questions I get where people are asking for advice, the vast majority of issues arise not from physical complications, but from mental and emotional ones. People dealing with awful sub-drop, being abandoned by their partner suddenly after play, feeling horrible about the things that they're into, the guilt, the shame, all of that can be really, really deep. And I find in general is the most ignored thing when it comes to evaluating, is it a good idea for me personally to engage in this play or not, or to do this particular scene, or even to choose a type of aftercare somebody wants to have afterwards, right? The things that we play in BDSM can go in very unexpectedly dark and dangerous directions. And I always try to bring this up in my BDSM 101 videos where I talk about the risk associated with a particular type of play, right? Like, for example, having a hood over your head can suddenly make you feel really claustrophobic and can make you start to panic. Engaging in, let's say, a consensual non-consent scene, that can suddenly go in some really dark directions as well. And I think it's important we acknowledge and talk about those things when we are asking, is BDSM dangerous? Because we might be able to leave a scene without any sort of physical ramifications, but that doesn't mean there aren't emotional and mental ones as well, whether it comes to how you feel about yourself or how a relationship ends up going. you could end up in a power exchange dynamic that ends up being abusive. That is a risk we take when we choose to give ourselves to other people, when we choose to give our submission or be dominant over others. That can be something that people exploit. And I don't want to make it seem like everything is sunshine and rainbows and you don't have to worry about anything. And there's definitely a balancing act there between everything is great, don't worry about anything, and this is the most dangerous thing you'll ever do. And I think we have to individually find a balance between those two areas, right? You know, the sunshine and rainbows and being aware of the danger and not ignoring one for focusing on the other, because zeroing in on all of the risk, all of the danger can make it really hard to actually enjoy this thing. And that's why, in some small way, I do agree with the people who say, you know, BDSM is dangerous, but so is life, and we shouldn't let that stop us from living our lives, right? If BDSM is important to you, if it's fun, if it's something you want to do, zeroing in and only focusing on the risk and danger is going to prevent you from actually having fun. And so I think it's important to kind of take everything with a grain of salt, right? You know, have the sour with the sweet. Essentially, you know, enjoy the nice tasty dessert, but also remember to eat your vegetables and drink water and all of that good stuff, right? You want to have that balance in life where, you know, unless you're just a total thrill seeker and you just want to like leave care by the wayside, okay, if that's you, if that's your personality, go for it. I can't stop you. But I think the way to approach BDSM is to do so from an educated standpoint where you are aware of the risks, but not necessarily letting that vapor lock you into not doing anything at all. And that's basically what I wanted to talk about in this video here today. This wasn't something I like pre-planned a script for, so hopefully I made myself at least a little bit better understood than I did in that original hot take moment of like 2 minutes of a video, because this is something that I think is important, and hopefully you guys understand what I'm trying to say a little bit better. If you have further comments or questions related to this, please let me know down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this, if you want to see more from me, please do subscribe. I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related content. And finally, if you really enjoyed this, if you want to support my work, the best way to do that is through Patreon. Link to that will be down in the description box below. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.